So I know that some of you, or all of you, are at different degrees of familiarity with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Some of you, this is very new to you. Others, it's something you're quite familiar with. I'm approaching this as if you don't know much about it, and I do that with all due respect. So that way, if some of this is not new to you, it'll be a review and maybe you have things to add. And for the rest of you, this hopefully will make sense of, or begin to make sense of, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and really put, to some extent, oh, there goes the Palestinian flag.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Get away with that. Like it's over on top.
Yeah. But yeah, hopefully this will serve as an introduction. I sent a bunch of readings to Elaine,
Yes,
and I realized that's probably more than anyone can read, especially while you're teaching. It's about a semester's worth of readings that I offered to a college course I teach in Israel-Palestine at Clint Park. So you could just go forward one. So, oh, and by the way, let me also add, I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with anyone if you want the file. I have, well, it's on that computer. I have it on my USB.
And if you could,
it's in our courseware.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start with 3 myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict. The first myth is that they've been fighting for hundreds of years. That's just not true. In fact, I'll get into more detail later, but really less than 100 years, and it's not a constant war. The second myth is it's complicated. After I'm finished speaking, you might agree with this myth, but really, it's actually not that complicated of a conflict, and I'll get into a little more detail about that in a moment. But it's a relatively simple conflict to understand, sometimes depending on your perspective. And the third myth is that this conflict is all about religion. Again, it's not really. So just to go over these myths again, to demystify these myths. As far as the first myth, there's been periodic fighting between, Jews and Arabs since about 1917. And I'll go over why 1917. But this is, again, it's not a constant battle. There have been periods of stasis. There have been periods of conflict. And actually, there are really hundreds of years of coexistence between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in the land that is now called Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. As for number 2, I think you can explain this conflict with 2 dates and 2 events. The first one, 1948, the birth of Israel, according to Israelis, and the Nakba, or catastrophe, for Palestinians. Basically, this is the central root of the conflict. This is when a land that was called Palestine, that was inhabited by Arab, almost about 80% Arab Palestinians, was transformed overnight into a land called Israel, and over the course of several months, demographically changed to a land that was about 80% Jewish Israeli. And so in that moment, this territory transformed from a mostly Arab, mostly Muslim territory to a land that was mostly Jewish Israeli state. And for Palestinians, this is called the catastrophe, because this is the point at which they were quite literally ethnically cleansed from their homeland, wiped out of their homes, their villages, their farmland, and forced out of the state. And so much of the conflict is about rectifying this catastrophe for Palestinians. But for Israelis, particularly Israeli Jews, this is the birth of a new nation. This is the birth of the Jewish homeland. And so it's something that's celebrated. It'll be celebrated in 2 weeks, May 16th, I believe. Secondly, the second date and event that is important to know, and you can in many ways explain this whole conflict with these 2 dates, is 1967. 1967 is when, through a series of events which I'll get into later, Israel occupied the Palestinian West Bank and the Gaza Strip, in addition to the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt and the Golan Heights of Syria. But this is when the Israeli military took control of additional land that was inhabited by Palestinians. Israel still to this day occupies the West Bank, the Palestinian West Bank, and not officially occupies Gaza Strip, but in essence controls it. And so for Palestinians, this conflict is about returning to their land that they were ethnically cleansed from in 1948 and ending the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Right? There's more to it than that, but those two central events, those two central historical phenomena are really at the center of this conflict. And the myth, it's all about religion. Religion has something to do with this, but it's really mostly about land. It's about who has control and access to this territory. Is this going to be an exclusively Jewish state? Is it going to be an exclusively Palestinian state? Is it going to be some combination of the two? And this is true of this territory altogether, but also even of individual sites. Is really who has access to this territory, who has access to this land. And so it's a territorial conflict with cultural overtones, with religious overtones, but ultimately, first and foremost, it's a territorial conflict. So, having said that this is a simple conflict that's just about land and about 2 dates, I'm going to go through a fairly exhaustive, although certainly not entirely exhaustive and perhaps exhausting, timeline of key moments in historical geography of Israel and Palestine. And my biggest fear is that we're going to run out of time, and so some of these points I might have to go over more quickly than others. So we'll start 1030 BC, and we'll go right about up to the present. But this is an important time, particularly in the memory of Jewish Israelis. So 1030 BCE, before the Common Era, to 722, there was the Kingdom of Israel, or the Kingdom of David, kingdoms of David and Solomon. What you can see here on this map, the white border is the current border of the post-1949 border of Israel, and the kingdoms of David and Solomon. These are the roots of the Jewish presence in this territory. So when people say this conflict goes back hundreds of years or thousands of years, they're referring to this origin, that this was a territory inhabited, not just inhabited by, but controlled mostly by Jews as far back as, what was it, I don't even remember these dates, I'm not a historian, 1030, 1070 BCE. Many Israelis, their claim to this land is rooted in this map. They say, this is our land. It was our land. We were uprooted from this land. We are now returning to this land, right? And so this map is very important in the Israeli consciousness of their legitimacy to be here. So from 700 BCE, and we're going to fast forward quite a few hundred years here, to 1516. This land that was called Palestine, that's now called Israel, was under the rule of several empires, and I won't go over them in detail, but it was under the Persian Empire, Hellenistic Empire, the Roman Empire, various Islamic empires. Like much of the Middle East, it sort of changed hands as empires rose and fell. Important to note, though, that amidst that time, starting in the 7th century in the Common Era, this became a predominantly Arab land. As the religion of Islam was born and Islam spread from the Arabian Peninsula across the region, the spread of Islam also brought with it a spread of the Arab ethnicity, the Arabic language, and Palestine was predominantly Arab and Muslim. There were still Jews there were still Christians. It was a multi-religious and really multi-ethnic society. But anyway, we can talk about that some other time. From 1516 to 1917, the land that we now know as Israel and the Palestinian territories was under Ottoman rule. And I understand you just had a lecture on Turkey, and so maybe...
Ottoman, yeah.
Okay, so this hopefully is somewhat familiar to you. If you just go forward one, you've probably seen something like this. This is a map of the rise of the Ottoman Empire, and you can see from the beginning, or from not the very beginnings, but from the early ages of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine, Israel was under the Ottoman control. This is the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century and early 20th century. Still really until the end of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was part of it. This is not the greatest map, but it's the only map of Palestine I could find under Ottoman rule, and actually Palestine, Jordan, and Syria and Lebanon. And under Ottoman rule, Palestine still retained its majority Arab ethnicity. Most people still spoke Arabic. The Ottomans, as you may have learned in the previous lecture, had a relatively loose rule over their empire, so it wasn't like the religion, culture, language it's not that they were wiped out, but there's still some Ottoman influences left in Israel-Palestine today. So as the Ottoman Empire was starting to crumble, a new movement began called Zionism in the 1880s. Is anyone familiar with Zionism? Most of you are, okay. And basically, Zionism was a movement of European Jews, mostly Eastern European Jews, to establish a Jewish state. And there was debate among early Zionists of where this Jewish state would be. A lot of people said, well, the ancient land of Israel, where the kingdom of David and Solomon were, so Palestine. But others suggested maybe Uganda, maybe Argentina. But the idea was European Jews were facing horrendous anti-Semitism, violence. Basically, the Jewish community concluded we cannot assimilate to European society. Not because we don't want to necessarily, but it's impossible. Clearly, we're not wanted here. And so, as sort of a life-saving measure, many European Jews started this Zionist movement as a way to really save the Jewish people from outright extinction.
How much of this early Zionism do you think was driven by the growing nationalism of, the nationalism was creating an identity that was so rooted in culture and heritage that there was a push-pull factor? Do you think there's an issue?
Yeah, I think in two ways. One, the nationalism of various European nations excluded Jews from their nation, but also I think the spirit of nationalism was very much wrapped up in Zionism, right? This idea that, well, we're a nation too, so all we need is land and borders and so forth. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. So Jews start migrating from Europe to Palestine, and at this point it's still called Palestine, still referred to as Palestine. But really, it's a trickle in. If you can go forward one. This is a map from 1878, so right before the Zionist movement started. All of those red dots are Palestinian villages, and the black dots are mixed towns or cities. So you have Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, etc. are towns that have a mixed Jewish, Muslim, Christian presence. And a lot of the Jews here are indigenous to the land at this point. They are not European Jews living there. They are, some people might identify themselves as Arab Jews, or in today's language, Sephardic Jews who are living there. So the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Zionist movement is beginning. In 1916, the quote-unquote great European powers have a meeting, basically a secret meeting amidst World War I, to make plans for this land, really the broader Middle East, after the Ottoman Empire officially falls. Who's going to take control of the Middle East? This is, remember, amidst not just nationalism, but the wave of colonialism. And so you have European powers colonizing all of Africa, South Asia, etc. The entire world, almost the entire world, was colonized by one European power or another. And so there was just this idea, well, we need to take control of the Middle East now that the Ottoman Empire is falling. So they came up with this map called the Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1960. And as you can see, it was basically split between French and British influence, which was sort of a euphemistic way of saying colonization. But the land that was Palestine then, we now know as Israel and Palestinian territories, they proposed it would be an international zone. And also you can see that's part of Egypt, part of Jordan, part of Lebanon. This would be an international zone managed by, again, international is a euphemistic way of saying European zone, managed by the European powers. Right? So that's 1916. 1917, yeah, that's good, yeah. So the Balfour Declaration was proclaimed. And this is one of the most important moments in the history of Israel-Palestine. This is a letter to the Rothschild family, which was a very prominent Zionist family man. And it's from the Foreign Office of the British Kingdom. And basically what this says is the British are promising the Zionist movement that we will foster the creation of a Jewish state. Or, although they don't use the word Jewish state, they say Jewish homeland, I believe. Trying to read this. A national home for the Jewish people. Okay? And so this wasn't just a private letter. It was made the news across the world. The British were officially declaring, we are going to take control of Palestine so that it can be a Jewish homeland, right? So that this Zionist movement can create a Jewish home. So when this was, before this was declared, before Balfour declares his intention to create this Jewish homeland, the early Zionists in Palestine lived in relative peace and harmony with the indigenous Palestinian community. Like any population, there were various spats here and there, but you hear many stories of people living in the same towns, same villages, sometimes the same buildings, and it was just this multi-ethnic society. Most Palestinians at this time, until the Balfour Declaration, didn't realize the plans of the Zionists to take over this whole territory and to establish it as a majority Jewish state. And so either out of ignorance or out of just disbelief that, oh, they're not going to be able to do that, we outnumber them about 9-1, there was just basic relative peace and harmony among the Jews and the Arabs in this land. But once they learned about the Balfour Declaration, they started getting very afraid that they're going to lose their land. They're going to lose individually their homes, their farmland. They're going to lose their this broader territory, which in the European sense was not officially a nation state, but it was considered a national home. They identified as Palestinians, as part of this Palestinian territory. And so this is when we start to see a little bit more conflict. Some violent skirmishes break out here and there. There is an increasing nationalism among Palestinians now, and a genuine paranoia, really, among Palestinians. Yes?
How did the imperial powers also, Hussein McMahon, promise the Palestinian, or promise them, the Palestinians, independence, sort of? Prior to this, that they were sort of talking out of two sides of their mouth too, so that.
Yeah, and even
do I have that correct?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I was actually, I'm glad you brought that up. You can go back a couple to the Balfour Declaration. In this same letter, it says in the middle of that page, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Right, so there was in this letter this sort of promise from the Brits.
I mean, even prior to that, I thought that the Hussein McMahon had promised something to the.
It's the Hashemite.
That they were going to get independence through an agreement. In that, I have to look at it.
Yeah, that may have been true. I'm not as
familiar
familiar
with
with
that. And then the Ottomans are basically, if you side with us against the Ottomans, we're going to give you independence.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was
And
in a
Hussein McMahon, I thought,
Right.
sort of solidified that, and then this promise it the other way. So they were
Yeah.
sort of like, we'll give it to you. No, we're going to give it to you. And
Exactly. And so, yeah, and there were, I mean, World War I, you had Palestinians fighting, some Palestinians fighting on each side,
so it
actually.
was even worse than just getting it. It was like, we're going to give it to you, and we lied to you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. So, 1920, this Sykes-Picot Agreement solidifies and slightly changes. And what's called the British Mandate Rule begins. Go to the next one. There's a map. So this kind of looks like the Sykes-Picot map, but this is what actually transpired. So the British take control of Palestine, what was called Transjordan, what's now called Jordan now, and Iraq. And the French take control of Syria and Lebanon. Right? And this is why if you go to Syria or Lebanon now, there's still French taught in the schools, and still French influences there. But British take control of Palestine. Throughout the Mandate period, as it's called, from 1920 to 1948, there's this uneasy and periodically conflicting relationship between the British, the Zionists, and the Palestinians. Some Zionists worked alongside the British. Some Zionists actively and openly fought against the British. They saw them as the real enemy. They wanted to create this Jewish state, the state of Israel, and in order to do so, they felt that they had to violently overthrow the British mandate. And the Palestinians were kind of getting it at both sides, from the British and from the Zionists. Go ahead. So this is, again, though, if you look at this map, this is the beginning of British Mandate. You still have a vast majority population of Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs. But, and I don't know if you can see the difference between the blue and the black dots. I can't from here. But you have more and more, an increasing number of European Jews settling in Palestine, creating these Zionist colonies. And the big difference, one of the differences between Zionist settlements in Palestine during this period and the Jewish presence in Palestine prior to Zionism is that the Zionists were settling in towns and villages that were explicitly and exclusively Jewish. Right? They were not interested in living in mixed villages, mixed towns with Palestinians, with some exceptions, of course. But as part of the Zionist movement, it was a creation of really an exclusively Jewish state. Yes.
And were they then creating these towns? I mean, they were just going to lands, finding lands, and building towns and villages that way.
And
Or the
then-
existing structures they were taking over? Or?
Both, really,
Okay.
both. But mostly during this period, they were going to farmland and bit by bit buying it, really, from the landowners.
What were those absentee landlords, owners, weren't they? Or typically there were farmers there, but the land, they lived in the towns, right? The Zionists had money because a lot of them were funded by European and Americans, so they had cash, and that was what got them in the land, right?
Yeah, so they would buy them sometimes from absentee landowners, sometimes from just people who wanted to sell their land, who either didn't know or didn't care that the Zionists weren't planning to give it back or sell it back. But it was bit by bit. They were buying up farmland, and as you suggested, yeah, sometimes it was just buying up uninhabited, unbuilt upon, undeveloped land, and then building a village or farming it in a certain way. Other times it was buying particular houses and villages. But nevertheless, it's a trickle. It's a trickle into Palestine. It's still, the vast majority of people are Palestinian Arabs. Go ahead. And so the British Mandate rolls on. I'm skipping a decade in here in the 30s when there were uprisings against British Mandate by Palestinians and against Zionists in the 1930s. But the Nazi Holocaust obviously plays a huge role in the creation of Israel. And I don't need to teach any of you about the Nazi Holocaust. You're all teachers, most of you, I think, history and social studies teachers. So, but the Nazi Holocaust played a role, two major roles in creating the state of Israel. One, this was really and this is probably not the best way to put it. The best way I can think of saying it is a vindication of Zionism. It was saying, see, we clearly can't stay here. We can't stay in Europe. And it was simply who wouldn't be afraid for their lives and who wouldn't want to leave Europe as the Holocaust is unfolding. And even pre-Holocaust, obviously, Jews are having an increasingly difficult time staying in Europe. And on the other hand, the European powers and the United States after World War II, after the Holocaust ended, had tremendous guilt that they let this happen. And so there was this sentiment, and you can read the historical documents to see how this sentiment was expressed of, well, we got to do something now. And so the creation of the Jewish nation state, the creation of Israel, was in many ways a response to this guilt, saying, well, we clearly were irresponsible in not stopping the Holocaust soon enough, and so maybe the creation of this Jewish state will, in some small way, make up for that horrible historical mistake. So, 1947, the United Nations decides to partition the land of Palestine. They see this as a perhaps imperfect solution to the inevitable problem of the creation of an exclusively Jewish state and the existence of a Palestinian Arab indigenous population. And so they propose, let's split this land into two different states, one Jewish state and one Arab Palestinian state. Now, this is a map right as the partition plan was announced. As you can see, now there's a greater number of, or there's a greater Jewish presence in Palestine than there was in 1920. Zionism has picked up considerably, especially after the Holocaust. But it's still a minority. It's still a minority of land controlled by Zionists, and it's still a minority of population. So if you go to the next map, this is the partition plan that was recommended by the United Nations. It's in essence the first two-state solution that was proposed. And the yellow portions would be the Arab state, and the orange portions would be the Jewish state, with Jerusalem in white in the middle there, again, administered by the United Nations. The Palestinians rejected this plan. Why do you think the Palestinians rejected this plan?
They don't think there's any room for Israel at all. I mean, they feel that this is their property, their territory.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk to any Palestinian, they say one-state solution. They say two-state solution is ridiculous.
Well, we can get into that later. I think the Palestinian community is split right now, really, between one state and two states. But basically, Palestinians saw this as they're going to lose a big chunk of their land, their homes, their land, anything that's in orange, they would lose, right? So it would necessitate an ethnic cleansing of that those territories into these yellow areas.
And the Jewish population is still rather small at this point,
right?
In comparison, so
right. So it's
sort of a slap in the face. I'm going to give you half of our country for such a small group.
Right.
Well,
but
I don't remember but the statistics for like arable land, like the percentage of arable land that went to the Palestinians was ridiculously low.
It's pretty small, yeah.
So like they got a non-contiguous state that had virtually no arable land compared to they had the majority of the people and all of the land.
Yeah, even part of that, it was like 7% of the land, but 20% of the Arab land.
It was,
So much like the Native Americans.
Yes, that's what
But for the Zionists, I mean, there was a real fear, shell shock from the Holocaust, and this idea that we can't be the minority anywhere. Our lives are in danger. And even though, the Holocaust happened in Western Europe, and Palestinians, for the most part, had nothing to do with it. There's a couple Palestinians who colluded with Hitler. There are also a few Zionists who colluded with Hitler. That's a whole different story. But my point being, these are geographically, historically, politically distinct parts of the world. But still, among Zionists, there was this idea of, if not now, when are we going to do this? If we don't create a nation state for us, where we are the majority, where we can control the land, the territory, the politics, this is just going to happen again and again. We're going to get pushed out of this land. We're going to just keep moving. Remember, this is a group of people who are, many of whom feel like they haven't had a homeland for the last 3,000 years. So there was a fear that pushed them into making this division and to recommending this division. Nevertheless, Palestinians rejected this division, and as soon as as soon as the partition plan was announced and the Palestinians rejected it, a civil war broke out in 1947 between the Zionists and the Palestinians. This civil war led up to May 16th, 1948, the birth of Israel, or as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba. Right? 1948, the United Nations votes for the state of Israel to come into existence. The United States, as you'll hear U.S. politicians say all the time, were the first country to endorse the new state of Israel. So Israel is born in 1948. Amidst this civil war, immediately after declaring their independence from the British, and that's why May 16th is not just called the birth of Israel Day, it's called Independence Day for Israel, because this is when the British mandate ends. The British leave. And the British were ready to leave. They were like, fine, we don't want to be here either. But Israel is created, and immediately as it's created, the same day, most of the surrounding Arab countries go to war with the new state of Israel. So this includes Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia. Did Saudi Arabia go to war with Israel? I believe they sent troops. Go to the next slide. So, State of Israel is born, Palestine post. And by the way, top left, I've always wondered who Karl Marx with a C is, but it's not any relation to Karl Marx with a K.
That's fascinating.
Go ahead. The war between these neighboring states resulted in this map. To put it simply, Israel at first was fighting off the Jordanians, Egyptians, Syrians, and Lebanese. But once it won those battles, it expanded to this territory here. So it's an expansion of the partition plan. And actually, if you look at early Zionist maps, in fact, not even early Zionist maps, I think it was 1938 or the early 1940s, the Zionist leadership produced a map exactly like this one. And so this was in the plans of the Zionist leadership. With or without this war, this was at least the starting point of the territory that they wanted. Importantly, though, the land west of the Jordan River, on the west bank of the Jordan River, which we know now as the West Bank or the occupied West Bank, this was controlled by Jordan. Okay, the Gaza Strip in the southwestern part of Israel, this was controlled by Egypt. And so today, Israel occupies the West Bank, Israel occupies Gaza Strip, or they control the Gaza Strip. Many Israelis will suggest as a solution to the end of the occupation, well, why don't we just give the West Bank back to Jordan? Why don't we give Gaza Strip back to Egypt? But nevertheless, even though Jordan was controlling the West Bank, Egypt was controlling the Gaza Strip, there were Palestinians who were living there. It was more of an administrative, military, political control. It wasn't that Jordanian population had rushed into the West Bank and took control of this land. So in 1948, two rights to return were established. Okay, the first one, the United Nations Resolution 194, signed in December 1948, declared United Nations General Assembly resolves that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practical date. What this is referring to are the Palestinian refugees. 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their land from Palestine. Subsequent research has shown that it was a systematic, intentional ethnic cleansing. In other words, part of the plans of creating this State of Israel was to systematically, ethnically cleanse Palestinians out of this land. It wasn't complete. There was still, at the birth of the Israeli state, there was a minority Palestinian population. But nevertheless, you have Palestinians who are ousted from Palestine. They are living as refugees. And the United Nations passes this resolution that Palestinians should be able to return to their homeland in what is now Israel. To this day, the State of Israel has not allowed Palestinians to return, aside from a few hundred, if that many. And a central part of the Palestinian struggle, as I suggested earlier, is this right of return. Return to their homeland, in many cases, the houses that are still standing that people are living in now. Many of the villages were just destroyed and leveled to the ground. So any sort of return to those villages would be kind of symbolic. But anyway, so that's the one right of return. The second is the Jewish right of return. When the State of Israel was established, they declared as a central component of their statehood that the State of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of the exiles. And the idea behind this was that any Jewish person anywhere in the world could return to their homeland of Israel. And this is where we go back to, I don't have it up here, but if you think back to the earlier map of the kingdoms of David and Solomon, the biblical land of Israel. And so the return to that land of Jews that they were exiled from however many hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And this right of return still exists today. someone can become immediately an Israeli citizen by stepping foot into Israel. It's a little more complicated than that. They have to be Jewish by birth, so their mother has to be Jewish, or they can be a convert to Judaism if they were converted by an approved Orthodox rabbi. So, for example, I have a friend actually from Erie who is a convert to Judaism, but she wasn't converted into Orthodox Judaism. Her dad is not, or her dad's Jewish. Let me get this straight. She's not a convert. Her dad is Jewish. Her mom is Catholic, and so according to Israeli law, she is not Jewish. But she identifies as Jewish. She practices as a Jew, and so she has moved to Jerusalem, but she is not an Israeli citizen because she was not. She's not the right kind of Jewish person, essentially. But if you are Jewish by birth, or if you convert into the right kind of Orthodox Judaism, you can become an Israeli citizen immediately, overnight. And so we have these two rights of return. Palestinians who are still longing for their right to return, and the diaspora of Jews around the world who can exercise their right of return. And for many Palestinians, this is the central injustice of this conflict. So this, I probably should have had this map a few slides before, but this is, as a result of the 1948 war, the population movements. And like I said, this land went from about an 80% Palestinian Arab majority to about an 80% Jewish Israeli majority, almost overnight. And you can see most of the Israeli Jews are coming from Europe, some from Asia, some from other parts of the Middle East. There was terrible ethnic cleansing, really, of Jews in many Arab countries as the state of Israel was formed. Jews were driven out of their homes in many Arab countries, and they flocked to Israel. And then there were Palestinians, who majority of whom went to the West Bank. And so you have, in the West Bank, you have Palestinians who are indigenous to the West Bank, but you also have Palestinian refugees in the West Bank. And so there are still to this day, if you go to the next slide, United Nations registered Palestinian refugee camps in the West Bank. There are some in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and also in the Gaza Strip. And Elaine, did you say you are going to go to a refugee camp in Jordan?
Yes.
Okay, good. Do you know which one or where on that map?
BAQAA, so close to Amman.
Okay.
Yeah. Look at the number in Damascus.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, think what Palestinians, and I know that's a huge issue, the Palestinians in Damascus who are left. Wow.
Right. And so, yeah, a lot of Palestinians in Damascus are now twice exiled. They've been forced to leave Damascus, and many of them are now in refugee camps in Jordan.
I'm guessing 3 times, because those were established in 1967.
Right, good point. Yeah.
Those are 6. Oh, yeah.
And I lived in Lebanon for a year, and same thing, you have Palestinians in camps in Lebanon, and then for various reasons at various times, fighting has broken out in those camps, and then they're exiled again. So it's just, I met a guy actually, a Palestinian guy who was a refugee in Iraq, and then had to leave Iraq during the Iraq War, went to camps in Tripoli, and there was fighting in Tripoli, and he had to leave Tripoli. So it's just this like constant exile. Go ahead. So, State of Israel is born. We have Palestinian refugees across the Middle East. 1956, Israel's first international crisis since its founding, since the war, the Suez Crisis. In 1956, Israel attempted to occupy the Sinai Peninsula, and they did so with the help of the British and the French. And really, they were seeking more than anything else to control the Suez Canal, because as you can imagine, this is geopolitically a very important point. If you can control this Suez Canal, you can control what goes in and out of the Mediterranean Sea. You can control what comes from the Arab or Persian Gulf, ultimately up through into Europe. But interestingly enough, it was the United States who stopped this total takeover of the Sinai Peninsula. Not militarily, but diplomatically, the United States stepped in and basically were like, back off to the French, the British, and the Israelis. And so this was really a temporary occupation. This was also the birth of, not to go on too far of a tangent, but of Gamal Nasser. You may have heard of Nasser, Arab nationalism coming out of Egypt through this, the presidency of Nasser. He's gained a lot of his popularity by leading the charge from the Egyptian side to move out the British, the French, and the Israelis from the Sinai Peninsula. So this was really a failed occupation. They were forced to withdraw. But keep that map in mind. 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, better known as the PLO, is formed. This was formed initially in 1964 by many of the neighboring Arab states. And so like many things, for better and worse, in Palestinian politics, it was a movement at first directed and controlled by these large Arab states who may have had some sympathies for the Palestinians, but also were strategically looking out for their own interests as well. 1967, the Six-Day War takes place. In June 1967, there's many, as is true for this entire conflict, there are many different ways to tell this story, so I'll try to tell it as straightforwardly as I can. The Egyptian military was in the Sinai Peninsula in Egyptian territory and were relatively close to the Israeli border. The Israeli government, the Israeli military saw this as a threat, that they were going to invade Israel. And so Israel preemptively strikes Egypt. And this war breaks out. That's sort of the simplest way to teach it. A war between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and then to a lesser extent, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and Lebanon. These Arab states were very quickly defeated in 6 days by the new state of Israel. And this really shocked the world, that this geographically tiny state of Israel, this new young state of Israel, could defeat all of these neighboring Arab states in one fell swoop. Very, very quickly defeats Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Lebanon, etc. And in doing so, the Israeli occupation begins. And this is an occupation, as we'll see, in large part is still here today. So remember the 1956 war? Actually, can we go back? Sorry, I'm like gesticulating. Sit on my hands here. So remember the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Israel tried to occupy the Sinai Peninsula. Now they do. Starting in 1967, they occupy the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. They also occupy the Gaza Strip, which is Palestinian inhabited still, and the West Bank. They take that essentially back from Jordan and occupy the West Bank and the Golan Heights in Syria, which is in the news more now because the Syrian war is sort of spilling over to a certain extent into the Golan Heights. Eventually, as I'll detail a little bit later, Israel withdraws from the Sinai Peninsula, which really ended in 1982, their occupation of the Sinai Peninsula, but to this day still occupies the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and the Golan Heights. The Gaza Strip, some people will say it's not an occupation, it's a siege, but they control the Gaza Strip, however you want to explain it. Go ahead. So, 1967, the PLO is now in Palestinian hands. It's no longer in the hands of Jordan and Egypt, Kuwait. Is now in the hands of Palestinians, particularly under Yasser Arafat, whom you probably are all heard of, and his Fatah movement. And they moved to Jordan. Under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, they really couldn't exist. And if they did, it would be completely clandestine. So they moved to Jordan. And in Jordan, for a short while, they have, depending on who you talk to, rock star status in Jordan. I mean, literally, like walking the streets of Amman with their machine guns. Many Jordanians saw them as potential heroes. These are the people who are going to fight for Palestinian liberation, literally. And they really had this relationship with the Jordanian state of tolerance. You know, yeah, do what you got to do. That honeymoon doesn't last very long. As the PLO starts attacking Israel and guerrilla attacks across the border from Jordan, and Israel responds with attacks on Palestinians in Jordan, which inevitably also killed Jordanians. The Jordanian leadership was like, this is enough. Halas, get out. 1971, the Palestine PLO is kicked out of Jordan and moves to Lebanon. And it enjoy is a euphemism, but had a similar relationship with Lebanon as they did with Jordan. This really, in many ways, was a key factor in the start of the Lebanese Civil War in 1976. And basically, to this day, there's a lot of tension in Lebanon around Palestinian presence. As many Lebanese, particularly Christian Lebanese, feel that Palestinians shouldn't be in Lebanon, go fight your fight somewhere else, you're getting in our way, and so forth. But anyway, PLO is in Jordan, in Lebanon, starting in 1971. 1973, the Arab states who lost their territory to Israel in 1967, particularly Jordan and Egypt, launched a war against Israel in October during the Yom Kippur. So that's why this war is often referred to as the Yom Kippur War. Basically to gain back this territory that they lost to Israel in 1967. This was a war in its initial weeks, and I say weeks because unlike the 67 war, it did last at least a month. Initially, it seemed that they might actually defeat Israel. Israel at this point, probably the only time in its existence since 1948, was in an existential crisis. At least they legitimately saw it that way, that if we lose this war, it could be the end of Israel. The United States had already been supporting Israel really since its beginning and militarily since 1967. But in 1973 is when the United States basically said, whatever you need, you can have in terms of weapons. And so this is when the United States starts giving Israel about $3 billion every single year in military aid, which continues to this day. And this was at a key moment in this war in 1973 when the United States airlifted all of these arms to Israel, and that was really the turning point in the war. Now backed militarily by the United States with their arms, not with soldiers, aside from the advisory role, Israel defeats Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and maintains its occupation of those lands. Any questions so far?
Well, I know that in Egyptian history, 1973 is considered a great victory. You know, I mean, it's celebrated, and because they call it the crossing, right? That's when they crossed over into the Suez Canal. And didn't they gain something out of this?
Yeah. So if you we'll get to Egypt in a second. In 1978, I should have had the Egyptian part first. Anyway, 1978, after the Yom Kippur War, Israel occupies southern Lebanon. Up to that southernmost river, the Litani River. Okay, and Israel occupies southern Lebanon until 2000. When essentially Hezbollah, for everything else that they do, Hezbollah pushed Israel back across the border. Basically fought them until the Israeli public was like, no, we don't. This is too much of a losing battle. We have no purpose to be in Lebanon. So the Israeli military withdrew from Lebanon. Hezbollah and many of their supporters will argue that Hezbollah is the only military power in the world ever to defeat Israel. They are the only military power actually to win a war against Israel. And that can be debated, and perhaps the Egyptians might debate that. But yes, so in 1979, this really, and I'm glad you pointed that out, is a long-term result of the 1973 war. Israel and Egypt started making inroads to peace, to a peace treaty, and this was finalized in 1979. You may have seen this picture before. Jimmy Carter, his probably most famous moment in his presidency, brokers this peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. And this is a peace treaty that still holds today. The United States immediately, or shortly after this peace treaty was signed, has been giving Egypt $1.5 billion in military aid every single year. And American and Israeli nervousness over the Egyptian uprising starting in February 2011 had a lot to do with their fear that this peace treaty was going to be broken, that this peace treaty was going to end, and that relationship would stop. Israel begins withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula even before this treaty was signed. So in 1975, you can see it withdraws to that part of the Sinai Peninsula, in 79, and then finally, as part of the negotiations, withdraws in 1982 to the 1948-49 Israeli border. As you can see, the Gaza Strip still borders Egypt, that little tiny part, and that's really about 1 kilometer wide. The Gaza Strip borders Egypt. So this peace deal between Egypt and Israel was and continues to be of the utmost importance to Israelis, because with this peace treaty, Egypt can patrol the Egyptian-Israeli border. So Palestinians who might go into Egypt to get weapons or whatever, cross back and forth, Egypt prevents that from happening. Egypt works in solidarity with Israel to keep that border sealed. I'll get to the sealing of that border a little bit later. So, 1980s, Israel begins to settle more civilians into the West Bank and Gaza. So as part of this occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, since 1967, Israel was controlling the borders, controlling politically, economically, militarily, even culturally, the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And to some extent in the 1970s, they were settling civilians in the West Bank and Gaza. But in the 1980s, they ratchet up, encouraging Israeli civilians to settle in these territories. This is illegal under international law. It's not illegal to occupy, to militarily occupy a foreign land. The United States, for example, occupied Iraq in 2003. Even though that war was illegal, the occupation was not actually. But it is illegal to settle civilians into an occupied territory. For many Palestinians and many Israelis, they see these settlements as an indication that Israel has no plans ever to end this occupation. That in fact, they intend to really just expand Israeli territory and further displace Palestinians out of their homeland. So the settlements, this is why in the news I feel like, it's just mentioned, Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and to the untrained ear, you might think, what's wrong with some Israeli civilians living in the West Bank? Palestinians live there, why can't Israelis live there? But for Palestinians, what's wrong with it is, number one, it's a further loss of their land, it's further loss of their territory. And number two, Israeli settlers in the West Bank and Gaza are protected by all the civil rights of Israeli law. Palestinians in the same territory are not protected by those civil rights at all. They're ruled by military law. Right, so you have two people in the same territory with two legal systems, a geographic separation, and this is why many people, including people like Desmond Tutu and other South Africans, will say this is apartheid. This is apartheid. It's a geographic and legal separation of two different people. And of course, as John Kerry just learned last week, you use the word apartheid and it pisses a lot of people off. So he quickly retracted that and said, no, it's not an apartheid. But this is, whether you want to call it apartheid or not, this is why people call it apartheid. So this is a map that shows you Israeli settlements in the West Bank, and you can see the lines are Israeli-only roads, and then that green strip on the eastern part of the West Bank, or the West Bank of the Jordan River, this is Israeli military control over this land. All right, and so what you see, as Bill Clinton pointed out at one point, I think it was Bill Clinton, Palestine, if we want to call it that, is kind of a Swiss cheese of a state, right? It's got all of these holes. It's basically those white areas, and it gets worse, as I'll show. This is Jewish settlements in Gaza Strip, which actually were all withdrawn in 2005. But this is up till 2005. The blue areas where Israelis were settled in the Gaza Strip. And keep in mind, this is about, I think it's 14 kilometers long and about a mile or a kilometer and a half wide. So this is one of the most densely populated areas in the world to begin with. But now we have, or then there were Jewish Israeli settlements. Go ahead. So 1987. By 1987, there's, as you might imagine, growing resentment, anger, turmoil among Palestinians over this occupation. And many Palestinians felt like their neighboring Arab states have failed them, they're not really interested in them to begin with. And kind of organically, an intifada, or uprising of Palestinians, emerged. I think it was November 1987. And it started with really just a couple protests. There was an Israeli settler who ran over some Palestinian kids in the Gaza Strip. They said by accident, some people said it was intentional, and there were protests against that. Really, Palestinian teenagers, kids, throwing stones at Israeli military, protesting in the streets, and these really grew in many of the same ways, thank you, that the uprisings that we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia, and Libya, and Syria grew. Just starting kind of organically with a protest here and there, and then just another protest. And these protests were largely met with open gunfire, with mass imprisonment. And during this intifada, we saw 1,376 Palestinians killed and 94 Israelis killed. The first intifada was largely, although not entirely, a non-violent, or perhaps better put, non-armed violent uprising among Palestinians. I mean, at most it was throwing stones. Later in the Intifada, in the early 90s, it became a little bit more violent. People using machine guns, bombs, but by and large, it was a non-violent uprising. And the Palestinians I know look back to this Intifada with a lot of nostalgia. This was one of the most beautiful moments in our history. They say this was when men, women, children, adults all worked together. It wasn't just protests. It was little things like the Israeli occupation forces prohibited them from waving the Palestinian flag. It was against the Israeli military rule. And so Palestinian women in many towns would arrange their laundry in the colors of the Palestinian flag, line it up like on a clothesline. And just little forms of protest like that. Palestinians were required to pay taxes to the Israeli occupation, and they started in various towns just stopping the taxes, paying the taxes. And they actually had signs in English that said, no taxation without representation. So, drawing on the American history and trying to draw American attention into this. There was, cultural forms, music, dancing, whatever way people could figure out how to protest, they did. But as you can see, it was met very violently. There were thousands more injured, tens of thousands of Palestinians imprisoned. It was in those ways definitely a tragedy. But the result of this, and for many Palestinians and Israelis, this was one of the most hopeful and exciting moments in this conflict, the Oslo Peace Accords were signed. And this is where, I don't think I have a picture of this, with Bill Clinton brokers these talks between Yasser Arafat and the Israeli Rabin. And this was meant to be the beginning of a lasting long-term peace. And so, how am I doing with time, by the way?
7:15. I don't know how much farther. I don't know. I'm enjoying this, so I'm
Okay.
sorry.
All right. Well, if you need like a break or something.
Yeah.
No, you're good.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Oslo Agreement was signed. The central part of the Oslo Agreement was the creation of an interim Palestinian government, known as the Palestinian Authority, which still more or less exists, and eventually a Palestinian state. And so the Oslo Agreement really was a two-state solution. The creation of a Palestinian state next to this Israeli state. But as a sort of a transition, Israel agreed, and the United States agreed, that there would be a Palestinian government, known as the Palestinian Authority, to sort of kind of work in cooperation with Israel to make a smooth transition from Israeli occupation to the Israeli state. There would be a gradual redeployment of Israeli forces, so the Israeli military would gradually leave the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They split the West Bank up into three areas, which still exist today: Area A, Area B, and Area C. And so those red areas are Area A. These would be, and still are in many ways, in full control of the Palestinian Authority. So like if you go to Ramallah, you'll see Palestinian police officers, Palestinian soldiers, Bethlehem, Nablus. Hebron is a different story. That's a city that's split in half right now. And then the Area B would be Palestinian civil control, so like a Palestinian mayor, but Israeli military control. So the Israeli soldiers would still be there. In Area C, the green area, is full Israeli control, so political, military, etc. So this was the Oslo Agreement. The Palestinian state would be essentially the combination of the red and the gray areas. With Palestinians could technically live in the green areas, but they would be under Israeli control. Oslo leaves for future negotiations the control of Jerusalem, right, which I haven't really talked about at all today, and in many ways is central to this conflict. So, for example, this is what Jews call the Temple Mount, what Muslims call forgetting this name, Haram Sharif, yeah, or the Noble Sanctuary, the Dome on the Rock, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Western Wall is at the top left part of that square. This is an area that is controlled by Israel. Jews have access to it, although different access, whether you're a man or a woman, it's a different story. And right now, Jordan still controls the Noble Sanctuary. However, Jordan, yeah. Officially, there aren't Jordanian soldiers there or anything like that, but officially, legally, Jordan controls this. And by Israeli law, Israelis are not allowed to go there to pray. And I think this has religious roots, but also it's sort of part of this agreement to keep peace.
To the dome, did you say?
Right.
But you can't get there if you're not, they can't get there though.
Who can't get there?
Jordanians or Palestinians.
Well, Palestinians who live in Jerusalem can get there.
Right.
Palestinians in the West Bank, for the most part, can't get here. They can get a permit, they can apply for a permit, and if you're, I think, over 50, during Ramadan, they issue permits on Friday to, I think, women over 50, maybe men too over 50, and under 12 or something like that. And I was there actually during the beginning of Ramadan. No, it wasn't Ramadan, but I was there in May when that was the same restriction. It wasn't even Ramadan. And Palestinians will come in off the buses, they'll go there, and then they have to go fast to the buses to go back to the West Bank. Israel wants to control all of Jerusalem. This is not a conspiracy theory. I mean, Israel wants Jerusalem to be the undivided capital of Israel. According to international law, even according to the United States government, East Jerusalem, which includes all of the Old City, which is most of what you see here, East Jerusalem is Palestinian territory under occupation. So,
I mean, according to Israel, it is their capital.
yes, right. According to the United States, Tel Aviv.
The rest of the world, it's not, right?
Yeah.
But
Exactly. And so Oslo was basically like, we're not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. We'll leave that up to some later agreement. Basically kicking the can down the roads. Because if you don't come to some resolution on Jerusalem, this conflict will never end. And so right now you have, like I said, it's ultimately controlled by Israel, even though Jordan technically controls the noble sanctuary. And Palestinians, one thing I learned last summer being there, Palestinians are increasingly displaced from Jerusalem, to put it nicely. Basically, if you're Palestinian now, you have a blue identity card or a green identity card issued by Israel. If you have a green identity card, you are in the West Bank and you cannot go to Jerusalem without very difficult to get special permission. If you have a blue identity card, it means you're a resident of Jerusalem, and you can go to Jerusalem, you can go to other parts of Israel, you can go to the West Bank. People are losing their blue identity cards left and right. They'll go to college, for example, in Europe or the United States, and the Israeli government will say, well, you no longer live in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is not, the legal is Jerusalem is not the center of your life. And so they revoke your blue identity card. And this is happening systematically. And in fact, if you look at Israeli government plans, the plan is to never let the Palestinian population get above 30%. I think it's 30 or 27, something like around 30% of Jerusalem. And so to keep that figure, they're constantly revoking Palestinian residency in Jerusalem. But Oslo says, we're not going to deal with that. They also said, we're not going to deal with refugees, right? So all the refugees who are in Jordan and Lebanon and Syria, that's something we'll have to settle later. Settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, let's just, forget about that. And there's that map again. Settlements, go ahead. And security arrangements. So who's going to what extent can a Palestinian security force over those pink areas, area A, to what extent can they be armed? How will they be armed? Who will train them? And actually, it turns out the United States, led by a guy named General Dayton, has been training Palestinian forces but anyway, Oslo says, let's just deal with these things, these minor issues, later.
Well, I mean, so the big thing coming out of that would be the Palestinian Authority.
Mm-hmm.
Were they assuming then with this government, I hate to assume what they would assume, but that maybe now having dialogue with these two groups might ultimately hash out these other problems?
They're assuming that the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government
Would be able to then work on these other things together?
Yeah, that was the assumption. And still to this day, the Palestinian, well, actually a week or two ago, the Palestinian Authority, was working in collaboration with Israel around security And with this notion that, yeah, together we are going to create this peace, what's the word I'm looking for? Solution, and create a Palestinian state. So, yeah, and really when the Oslo Accord was signed, there was a lot of hope among Palestinians and Israelis. Because even though, we see this now and can see like how many things were left off the table and how many issues still needed to be resolved, this was still so much further than they had ever gotten. This is the first time that Israel would even use the word Palestine or Palestinian. They refused to use that word, Palestinian. They were Arabs. And still to this day, a lot of Israelis refuse to ever use the word Palestinian or Palestine.
This is when they got passports too,
Mhm.
correct? Right. So I mean, they had no passports. They couldn't even travel
Right.
until then.
Right. And so it was a step forward. There were also people like Edward Said, great Palestinian historian, comparative literature professor, who immediately, he wrote this piece like the day after Oslo was signed. He's like, this is a disaster. This is actually going to be worse for Palestinians than what we had. And now actually, even the Palestinian Authority is suggesting now, you know what? Through Area A, why don't you just take control of this? Because how can you even say that we're in control of this when Israel continues, on a daily basis invades Area A to make arrests, to demolish homes. It's really, they don't have much control. But on the surface, now instead of having 100% of the West Bank occupied by Israel, you have about 80 to 90% of it. So that is, and it's the major population centers, those cities that we're going to enjoy some autonomy. So Palestinians who had been living their entire lives under occupation saw this, okay, well, now we have a little bit of breathing room. Now I don't have Israeli soldiers walking down my street in my neighborhood. Now at least we have some semblance of a nation. Go ahead. And then the last thing that they left out is the border relations and cooperation with their neighbors. So in other words, peace treaties with Lebanon and actually at this point, right around the same time, Jordan, or a little bit after this, Jordan and Israel make a peace treaty. And so Jordan and Israel, as you may have learned already, are at peace with one another. They have a peace arrangement. They share diplomatic contacts and some security arrangements. But for Oslo, this was going to be, all of these peace treaties were just going to be left be disputed. So like Lebanon, for example, is still officially at war with Israel, and so same with Syria. These are a result of the '67 war, or even the '48 war, I think, still ongoing, legally speaking. Good. So that was 93. 2000, 2005, as a result really of Oslo not even really working how it was supposed to, and just continued further resentment among Palestinians that we're not getting anywhere, the second Intifada breaks out. This Intifada, unlike the first one, was very violent, not 100%, but more violence was used on the Palestinian side. This is when we start to see suicide bombings on a mass scale. This is where Hamas, the party that now rules the Gaza Strip, came to power or came to military power within Palestinian society and started calling for suicide bombings in civilian areas in Israel. It was a very bloody intifada. Still, as you can see, the deaths during the Intifada, so you have 1,000 Israeli deaths, which shouldn't be sneezed at. It's, of course, a tremendous number of people. And most of them, as you can see, were civilians. Still, there's 4,789 Palestinian deaths during the second Intifada. So it was a more violent Intifada by Palestinians, but an even more violent response by Israelis. I've never met or heard of anyone looking back at the second Intifada with nostalgia. The first Intifada is sort of the celebrated, that was when things were great. great movement. Second Intifada, most Palestinians I met, and of course, I don't speak for everyone, but most people said, yeah, the use of violence was really a mistake. Regardless of whether morally it's right or wrong, strategically it was a big mistake. So this was a very dark period, and the memories of the Second Intifada, especially for Israelis, are very, very sharp. Most people know someone who was killed during the Second Intifada. These were, as you probably remember from the news, suicide bombings in markets, on buses, in civilian populated areas. And the Second Intifada didn't really lead to much, aside from further bloodshed. The one thing that perhaps it did lead to is an intensification of the occupation. And this really started when the Intifada started, but it picked up really through the Intifada and through the present. So you have increased settlements in the West Bank. I don't have the numbers with me right now, but just in this last peace process, 14,000 new Israeli settlements were planned in the West Bank. That's in the last 10 months or so. This is a map which I just found today, actually. This shows the blue areas. The dark blue areas are Israeli settlements, and the lighter blue areas are controlled by Israel, although it's a little misleading because obviously east of the West Bank you have Jordan. And then the white areas, that's area B, and then the tannish areas, that's area A, which are still under Palestinian civil authority, or Palestinian, pretty much full Palestinian authority around those cities. And so now we can see even more so this fractured Palestinian, well, it's not a state, but Palestinian territory, where to travel from one part of the West Bank to another can take hours and hours, because there are roads that are Israeli-only roads, and there are roads that are Palestinian-only roads. And the Palestinian roads go around the mountain and all the way around the settlements, and to get 15 miles to the other side. So travel is very difficult. If you could go to the next slide, please. Starting in shortly after the breakout of the Second Intifada, I think it was 2003, Israel started constructing a separation barrier, which they call a security barrier or security fence. Some people call it an apartheid wall, so separation wall, whatever it's called. I have a picture of this. They started building this wall ostensibly to separate the West Bank from Israel, right, and to prevent suicide bombers coming from the occupied Palestinian territories into Israel. And in many parts it looks like that, and maybe that's hard to see. That's 30 meters high or 30 feet high, I think. Yeah, it's about 30 feet high. And if you go to the next slide, you can see that red line, and red and purple line is where the security barrier, separation barrier has been built or is under construction. Right, so what do you notice about the relationship between the barrier and the borders of the West Bank? Yeah, and it cuts into Palestinian territory, right? And really what it's doing is it's surrounding many of the major Israeli settlements. And so this also is considered illegal under international law. But for Palestinians, they see this as another land grab, right? Because once you build a wall around Palestinian land, even if there's no settlement there, there's literally no way for a Palestinian to get to that land. And so you have farmers who have seen the wall cut directly through their farmland. And there are some farmers who have made arrangements, they've gone through the Israeli courts to get access to their land, but they need a permit to go to their farmland, right? And they have to get the Israeli soldier to open up the gate and let them go. Go ahead. I think I mentioned there's an increasing number of Israeli-only roads that cut through the West Bank, which not only are Israeli-only, but they're a means of separating the land. So you can't cross these roads, you can't get on them, so it separates the territory. An increasing number of checkpoints. I think I have a map here of checkpoints throughout the West Bank. And so in addition to traveling on these roads that meander their way around the West Bank, you're periodically stopped at these checkpoints where these Israeli military is there. And when I was there last summer, I went through a lot of these checkpoints. You know, it's like an 18-year-old young woman or a young man with their machine guns. They open up the cars. If you're in a car, I was on a bus, they like go through the bus. For Palestinians, they now have biometric scanners where they scan their fingerprints and I think like do a whole body scan like you do in the airport. And they can also just shut down the checkpoint and say, no one's crossing for the next 4 hours, whatever. There are a lot of roaming checkpoints, so some of those are not always there. So in other words, at any given moment, the Israeli military can set up a checkpoint on a road. But there are others that are permanently there. So even to travel within the West Bank, Palestinians have to go through these checkpoints. So it takes forever to go from one place to another. And I was there last summer with a delegation of American professors, and our bus driver, it was like 12 of us, and then a Palestinian bus driver, he had a broken nose. He just had a broken nose, and I have no idea why. And we went to a checkpoint, and they barely let us through. And I asked our tour leader, what was that all about? And she said, they saw that he had a broken nose, so they assumed he probably was arrested, and he was beaten in jail. That was just their assumption, that you must have been in an Israeli jail and beaten up because you did something wrong, and so therefore you're suspicious, and we have to be very careful with you. And I don't know if that assumption was true. Of course, I didn't ask him or anything, but the checkpoints are actually. If you go one more slide, this is a picture of one of the checkpoints where these are Palestinians who are, I believe, actually going into Israel in the morning, because there are still Palestinians who work in Israel. And so every morning they'll show up at a checkpoint at 4 or 5 in the morning and wait a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours to get through the checkpoint and get to their jobs in Israel. This is, of all the Palestinians I've met in the West Bank, they say this is the most dehumanizing part of the occupation, is to be sort of shuttled through these checkpoints as if they were cattle. And then sometimes just denied for no reason. Just, you go through it every day for 7 weeks, and then one day they just say, nope, you're not going through today. So yeah, this is what occupation looks like for many Palestinians. In addition to the checkpoints, since 2000 and continuing to today, periodic territorial sieges and home raids. So in other words, let's say the Israeli government is looking for a Palestinian suspect that they think caused some terrorist attack. They'll put a siege around the whole town where they think this person is. In other words, they won't let anyone in or out. Often they'll have curfews, and then they'll raid homes. And this is something, the territorial sieges don't happen quite as much anymore, although they do periodically. There was just one a month ago after an Israeli soldier was killed in Hebron. But the home raids are on a daily basis, basically. When they need to make an arrest, they'll go into a home in the middle of the night and take the people out. They were arresting children this way. They would go and, so like children who were accused of throwing stones at Israeli soldiers, they'd go into their house in the middle of the night and take the child out of bed. They actually, through some Israeli peace organizations, they've agreed not to do overnight home raids for Palestinian children. Instead, they send a summons and come at a reasonable time. But the home raids continue. I just read about home raids last night. Go ahead. Home demolitions are increasingly common. This is almost daily, especially in East Jerusalem, but also in many parts of Area C in the West Bank, where Palestinians are basically told that their house is illegal because it was built without a permit. 97%, I think, of Palestinian applications for permits are denied. And so a lot of Palestinians just say, like, we're not going to get a permit, so we're going to build anyway. Other Palestinian homes existed before Israel existed. And so, of course, they didn't have a building permit to build it. But the legal justification is you didn't have a permit to build this, so we're going to demolish your home. And the reason that they're demolishing their home, in addition to perhaps that legal justification, is to really for one of two reasons. One, because they want to expand Israeli settlements in that area, or two, they want to expand the separation barrier. And so they'll demolish homes in the way. And literally, almost every day, Palestinian homes are demolished. If you follow MAN News, that's MAAN News English, it's a Palestinian news service. They keep track of this really well on almost daily basis. Just the other day, a mosque was demolished and several homes near Nablus. I think that was yesterday. So yeah, I think, what is it? 27,000 homes have been demolished since 1967, something like that. Go ahead. That's just a picture of what this looks like. It's European and American companies like Volvo. Caterpillar is one of the biggest bulldozer companies used by Israel, and this is why many colleges and American churches are calling to divest investments in Caterpillar in particular, because of their role in these home demolitions and occupations. So there are many college campuses that have recently, within the last year, divested from Caterpillar. The Students for Justice in Palestine, which I think you know more about than I do, is SJP, Students for Justice in Palestine, at different campuses have pressured their university to sell all their stocks of Caterpillar. I'm part of the Israel-Palestine Mission Network of the Presbyterian Church, and we're actually seeking to divest from Caterpillar, Motorola, and Hewlett-Packard. They're all involved in the occupation.
I don't understand. I mean, it's a piece of equipment that somebody's buying, you know. When I mean like that, it's like, you know, they could be driving Chevys or Fords. I don't understand that the whole idea here as a free market, you know, it's not the companies that are making the problems.
Well, Caterpillar in particular constructs bulldozers specifically for the Israeli military. They weaponize them. And so they work together with Israel to create bulldozers that for exactly these purposes.
So this would be kind of like during the Vietnam War, protesting companies that made like napalm and stuff like
exactly.
that.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, sanctions and boycotts are what really pushed apartheid to end in South Africa. I mean, that was really.
Yeah, but you know, the sanctions and all that were against companies in South Africa that were, you know, like, or any company like that. Well, Caterpillar is an American company that's in the marketplace. It makes contracts and sells equipment, you know, just like.
But you got to look at geographically, Israel is in need of a lot. It needs companies to work with them because of where they are.
Oh, every place in the United States needs that too. Every country has to contract with private sector, you know, and whoever makes the tanks, shoes, or whatever else. It could be Israel, it could be the United States.
But John, didn't we also boycott in South Africa? And I can barely remember that because it's a long time ago for me. But we also boycotted companies that did work, like Coca-Cola.
Yeah.
So it's similar to, I mean, we boycotted more than just South African companies.
No, so you boycott companies that do business in South Africa.
Yeah.
What about the other two companies? Are they creating specific products?
Yeah. Hewlett-Packard creates those biometric scanners that are used for the checkpoints. Hewlett-Packard also provides the hardware for the Israeli Navy. And Motorola produces these cell phones for the Israeli military, which, like, this endless battery life, which makes you think, like, why don't they create? Yeah, but that's a different story. But and Motorola is also involved in, I think, in the Israeli Navy as well. But so basically, they're producing products specifically for the Israeli military to use. And so I know, at least like with the Presbyterian Church, it's within Presbyterian rules, we're not allowed to invest in any company, any militarized company. So we don't have any investments in Lockheed Martin or Boeing or any of those. And so the justification for the Presbyterians is these are companies that are involved in militarization, regardless of where it is, and therefore we should divest. And I think for like college campuses, it's, essentially this college, or does Pitt have investments in these companies? Do you know?
Well, I know Sabra hummus is the big one.
Yeah.
That's sold at like literally every coffee cart on campus. So
Yeah.
that's something we want to work towards
Yeah.
booting off. Yeah.
Mhm.
SodaStream is another one that's produced
Yes.
Oh, really?
In a settlement.
in a settlement.
Yeah.
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 It's
What's her
Here,
name? Scarlett Johansson.
Yes.
yeah.
What's that?
Scarlett Johansson.
Is there a company in Pennsylvania that makes the rubber bullets?
She was
sponsor.
She was
I'm not sure about the
advertised.
rest.
Or some
Tear gas.
tear gas, okay.
Yeah.
Tear gas canisters.
Exactly.
So everyone
Because you
was
just said
there
they
at
went
one, I
back,
believe,
she
village
could
when they had
be
the protest.
Yeah, that's right.
A representative. Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
She was doing so.
It's a really good point that
Yusuf.
Yusuf,
I
it's
got
a good point.
I knew.
Yusuf just made the tear gas that the Israeli military uses is made 2 hours north of here, in Janesville, Pennsylvania. Jamestown.
Yeah.
Yeah, Combined Systems
I remember
International.
they was talking about that earlier.
Yeah. But it's a private company, so they don't have stocks. But
Yeah.
anyway, all right, let's proceed. Go ahead. So 2006, moving forward, Hamas wins legislative elections. The Palestinian Authority holds democratic elections, really at the urging of President Bush, among others. Bush's push toward democracy in the Middle East. And lo and behold, Hamas wins a majority of the legislature of the Palestinian Authority. Hamas, the same party that was sending suicide bombers into Israel, the same party that has periodically sent rockets into southern Israel from the Gaza Strip. They win legislative elections, which by all accounts were free, fair, and open elections. This wasn't a rigged election. This threw Israel and the United States into a pickle, particularly the United States, because the day before George Bush is like rah rah elections democracy, and then Hamas wins, and then they were like, oh, that's not who we wanted to win.
These are all kind of democracy.
Yeah, right. And so almost immediately Israel outlaws or delegitimizes the Palestinian Authority. It says, well, if Hamas is going to have any part in this, then this is not a legitimate government. And I mentioned before about how General Dayton, United States Army General, I think, was training Fatah troops in the West Bank as part of this. How are we going to train a Palestinian military? He leads Fatah into the Gaza Strip. Hamas fights Fatah in the Gaza Strip and defeats them pretty easily. And so Hamas takes full and total control over the Gaza Strip. Fatah takes control of the West Bank, and so now we have a split Palestinian leadership, which just last week or 2 weeks ago, they have reconciled. But they've reconciled before to no avail. So some people are saying, don't start celebrating yet. They've done this before and not really carried through. Go ahead.
So
Elaine.
was that kind of a divide and conquer, or was it Palestinian led, the disagreements, or was it instigated because the U.S. was giving more funding to one over another, or?
Both. I mean, the U.S. was arming and training Fatah. But Fatah and Hamas, for quite some time had major differences. I mean, for one, Fatah has always thought that negotiations with Israel would end this conflict, and Hamas has really been against negotiations. They believe more in armed resistance as a means of liberation. So yeah, there's definitely that split with or without the American influence, but America and Israel have been at varying degrees deeply invested in Hamas or in Fatah.
Does Fatah have like the red flag, or is that or like
Yes.
The green one.
Hamas has the green flag. Fatah has, I think it's yellow actually. Yellow. Yeah. The Palestine, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they have the red flag, which is like a Marxist group, which is since the fall of the Soviet Union has been kind of marginalized. There's a whole, like many countries outside the United States, there's a whole array of political parties in Palestine, but now mostly it's Hamas and Fatah are the really only two with any power. Okay, can you go to the next one, please? So I guess I just mentioned that the civil war between Palestinian Hamas and Fatah. Hamas takes control of Gaza Strip. Fatah takes control of West Bank. And when I say control, that's within the confines of Israeli occupation still. Go ahead. 2006 to the present. So after Hamas takes this control of Gaza Strip, Israel, who had withdrawn its settlers in 2005, lays a siege on Gaza, which to this day is present. So nothing and no one can go into Gaza or out of Gaza without Israel's permission. They have land, air, and sea seal around Gaza, and it is a very, very tight seal. The only way around it or under it is through the tunnels, Egypt. But the new Egyptian regime, the Sisi regime, they've literally filled some of these tunnels with manure and blocked others through other means. And so these tunnels, it's harder and harder for people and goods to come in and out of these tunnels.
How are they going to get their cans?
Right. Everything went in and out of these tunnels. Like I saw pictures of a cow, a live cow, and cars, as well as weaponry. This is the principal reason that Israel wants tunnels to be closed and borders around Gaza to be sealed, is because Hamas. The idea is we're going to cut Hamas off from weapons. Okay. This gives you an idea of what this siege looks like. That red line around the border of Gaza, that's not just someone with Photoshop and not using the right font. That border is, I think it's about 500 meters in from the legal border between Gaza and Israel. And so farmers who have farmland, they can't go out to that red part. Just yesterday, a Palestinian farmer was shot because he got too close to that red line. And those shootings happen all the time. He was shot in the foot. But yeah, they're constantly being shot at. Palestinian fishermen, which is one of the other major industries of Gaza, agriculture and fishing, now they can only go to that first line of 3 nautical miles. Before they could go out to that Gaza-Jericho agreement. It's not really, apparently it's not very good fishing 3 miles out, 3 nautical miles, but also they're constantly shot. So if they get too close to that limit, the Israeli Navy patrols, with the help of Hewlett-Packard, controls that nautical 3-mile line, and they'll fire on Palestinian fishing ships, sometimes with water cannons, other times with live ammunition. Go ahead. So 2006 to the present, Palestinians in Gaza, mostly Hamas, although not exclusively Hamas, Palestinians have been firing rockets from Gaza to southern Israel. And I don't mean to minimize the terror that people would feel if you had rockets flying into your backyard, but really the rockets are about maybe half the size of this table or so. Maybe some of them are about as long as that. They're about this wide. They're homemade rockets that are launched indiscriminately into southern Israel. So they do land in civilian areas. And periodically from about 2006 to the present, mostly Hamas, but also some allied groups in Gaza have been firing these rockets into Israel as they put it, as a means of resistance against the continued Israeli siege on Gaza. Other people will argue, Palestinians among them, well, you're just making it worse for us. But in any case, they're firing these rockets into southern Israel. And so that gives you a map. That's pretty hard to see, but just the range of the different rockets that they can fire. So they're, like during last year's war, I think there was a rocket that went all the way to Jerusalem. So that map actually is not even up to date. But most of them land somewhere in the southern Israel. And some of them actually land in Gaza. They don't make it all the way out of Gaza. They land in Gaza. Go ahead. So depending on whose perspective you look at, in response to this rocket fire, Israel launches a massive war on Gaza. This is the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. I think this is when I met you, Elaine. Right during that war.
Yeah. It's been that long.
Yeah.
Wow.
So Israel, if you go to the next slide, I think I have it mapped. This shows you all of the bombs that were dropped on Gaza and the casualties, civilian and otherwise. I think 12 Israelis were killed, but 9 of them were by friendly fire, or 10 of them were by friendly Israeli fire, by Gaza rockets, and something like, can't see it from here, how many Palestinians killed? It was like 1,000 something, 1,200 maybe. I think it just says you'd have to add up all of those figures on each. But in any case, hundreds and over 1,000, I believe, Palestinians were killed in this Gaza assault. And there was a student here hit. Do you remember Mazen, Elaine?
Who?
Mazen.
Mazen Kamsia?
No, not Mazen Kamsia. It was a master's student here in the management public administration.
Oh, not Gisbia.
Yeah, I think it was
Gisbia student. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, he was a Palestinian from Gaza who was studying here a couple of years ago, getting his master's degree. He was in Gaza during this war, and he said that basically they felt that nowhere was safe, so he and his friends would just walk the streets of Gaza as literally bombs are falling everywhere because they weren't safe in their house. Schools were bombed, hospitals were bombed, and so they just wandered the streets. His cousin was an ambulance driver, and his ambulance was bombed, and he was killed. So that was 2008, 2009. And 2012, this was fall of 2012, it was November 2012. That previous war was 3 weeks, and this one in 2012 was about, I think, just 2 weeks. But it was a similar style war. Hamas rockets fired into southern Israel, and Israeli bombs launched into Gaza. Go ahead, one more. Thanks. So that sort of brings us up to date, and there's still this question of the future, of course. What can be the resolution? Is there a resolution? And so for some people, many Israelis especially, I think increasingly, there's sort of this idea, well, what's wrong with the status quo? Even though they might not put it in those terms. Israel right now is relatively peaceful. There aren't suicide attacks going on right now. Gaza and the West Bank are pretty well contained, and so there are a lot of Israeli politicians who completely ignore this issue. And the Israeli public actually elected many of the Israeli parliamentarians in the Knesset, basically all on domestic grounds. Like, Palestinian issue didn't even come up in the elections for many people. And so it's this idea like, well, maybe this isn't ideal, but maybe this is the best we have. On the other hand, there are two completely different one-state solutions being proposed. There's one on the Israeli side of saying we should annex the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? Essentially make them part of Israel. Or not even just make them part. Many Israelis see the West Bank as Israel, right? They'll never say the West Bank. They won't say occupation. There's no occupation. This is Israel. This is part of greater biblical Israel, the land that God gave to us. And so, particularly Israeli politicians on the right wing, they do not want a two-state solution. They do not want a Palestinian state. So basically, one Israeli state, and if Palestinians have to be there, well, we can keep them under control in the same way that we have them. On the other side, many Palestinians, a growing number of Palestinians, but still a minority of Palestinians, and international activists are calling for one single state with equal rights among Israelis, Palestinians, Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, all within this state, which would include Israel, West Bank, and Gaza Strip. Some of the objections to that are, well, the Palestinian population, once the refugees come back, is going to outnumber the Israeli population. So once again, Israeli Jews will be in the minority. Other people like Jeff Halper, who's an Israeli, who runs the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, have proposed one state, but like a binational state. So no matter what the demographics are, Israel or Jews will always control 50% of the government. Palestinians will always control 50% of the government, right? To keep equality in the government. Ali Abu Lima, he was here at Pitt a number of years ago, I guess. He's written a book called One Country, I think that's what it's called. And he lays out several possible visions for one state. But basically the idea is, right now we do have one state there. Israel is really the only power controlling this territory, but there are completely unequal rights based on your ethnicity, based on your religion. The two-state solution is still popular among the majority of Israelis and Palestinians. In other words, an Israeli state in Israel, an independent, autonomous Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, in some way to travel between the West Bank and Gaza. Like maybe a devoted highway between the two or something like that. And Palestinians, as I suggested earlier, are split between one state and two states. And it's really, I'm finding it's more of a generational split. The older generations still want two states. Particularly those who are living in the West Bank. They've been living under Israeli occupation for most, if not all, their lives. They're just like, we want the Israelis to leave. We want to live here in peace in our own country. They can have their country over there. The younger generation, particularly among college students, intellectuals, they're calling more for one state. The refugees, I spent a lot of time in Lebanon in refugee camps, and I never met a Palestinian refugee who did not want one state. Because they say, well, my home wasn't in the West Bank. It was in Jaffa or wherever, which is now Israel. But, there's, because there's not consensus, that makes this resolution even harder. But the one-state solution is definitely growing in popularity. It's getting more attention now, but it should still be known that the majority of Israelis and Palestinians still want two states, at least according to the polling data. So that's all I have for today. Just, like I said, it's real simple, not complicated at all. So we can, I guess, have discussion, questions.
Yeah.
Well, this may be very unpopular to bring this up, and having traveled to Egypt and been involved in this aspect of this environment. But I'm sure that if we had an Israeli leader, whether it would be Big Ben or whoever else would be sitting next to you, I'm sure that they would interpret some of these events in a far different light than you would. What are some of the areas where you would find that you would probably have the most vehement debate?
Probably 1948. And yeah, the idea that there was ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. For the longest time, the official, not just the official Israeli narrative, but everything that was taught in schools, everything that most of the world outside of Palestinians and Israelis who were old enough to know it, what they knew was this was basically an empty land, and Israel came and developed it and established their state. Or, if you were a little bit more shrewd, you would say, well, Palestinians left on their own volition, or their leaders told them to leave. And, they had no sense of Palestinian nationality. They had no loyalty to the homeland. So why shouldn't they just go to Jordan or Israel or Lebanon? So yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people would disagree with. However, two Israeli historians, Benny Morris and Ilan Pape, have written books that, I mean, irrefutably demonstrate overwhelmingly that Palestinians were ethnically cleansed. In other words, they were forcibly removed from their homes, from their land by Israel. And it was a very well planned out strategy. And it was in really the origins of the Zionist movement. But, you know, Ilan Pape has been exiled from Israel. He can't show his face there anymore. They say he made that up. He's a self-hating Jew, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that 1948 would be the big disagreement. Probably the occupation.
After 67?
Yeah, in the 67 war, I mean, the way the Israeli narrative is, Israel was threatened by all of its neighbors. You know, Egypt was literally pointing guns and tanks at Israel, and it was a move of self-defense, also then to occupy these lands. So yeah, there's that, and then among more religiously minded Israelis, you know, they'll say, this was our land to begin with. Palestinians, you know, were only there for maybe some decades. God gave us this land, and it's ours. And Palestinians can go to Jordan, they can go to Lebanon, they can go to Syria, but this is our land, and we have every right to stay here. They'll also mention something I very briefly brushed over and didn't mention in any detail. In Hebron in the 1930s, it was in 1929, there was a massacre of Jews by Palestinians. I forget, it was like 33 or 60-something Jews were killed in Hebron, and this led to Jews leaving Hebron en masse. And so to this day, like if you go to Hebron, you see these signs, this land was stolen by Arabs, and you know, we need to reclaim it. Yeah, the separation barrier, you know, it would be called a security fence, like I said, and yeah, I don't know, those sorts of objections, I imagine.
It's another interesting thing. It's hard to describe and explain to students, but the foreign policy is typically drawn by, you know, a real dry sense of interest. But yet America's support of Israel has a very strong evangelical pull to it that kind of defies most every aspect of American foreign policy. How would you explain that? I mean, as a, you know, you're involved in a church group that has some, you know, how would you explain that?
Why American policy is so
And how
devoted.
will be evangelical? Because, you know, I say that they say it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It's really not a democracy. If you really look at a democracy, it's, I think the term Bantustan has been used a lot for, you know, dividing and conquering. The point is, how do you explain that in terms of, you know, evangelical and conservative support for Israel?
I think some of it is still Holocaust guilt or Holocaust prevention. This idea that, I mean, on the one hand, there's that, and there's this idea, well, no one else is going to protect the Jewish people, so we need to. But there's also, you know, as many of you might know, there's this idea among fundamentalist Christianity that the second coming of Christ is not going to take place unless the Jews control the land of Israel. And so it's in preparation for that. I mean, that's what Christian Zionism is largely about. So we need to create a situation where Jews control the Holy Land so that the second coming of Christ can come.
Is that what you were asking? I'm just
Yeah.
curious, is that what you were asking
And
about?
convert all
Yeah.
of them to Christians? Is that?
I don't know the Bible well enough
What was
No,
your
but that's
question?
not-
or I don't.
But I think like part of the story is that when the second coming of Christ, I mean, to create those conditions so that they all become Christians, that happens, which is just kind of.
I don't think so, because I
Or
don't
they go
think
to
that the
hell.
Jews get saved. I think that the Jews just have to be back in promised land.
This is
in
all
order
part of
for
rapture, is this all
the
part of,
rapture
and
to
that's a
occur.
relatively new theology, man. That's
So I
like
don't
19th
think, because
century.
I actually, the way that I've understood it, maybe you
Because I heard that
know,
before.
is that the Jews don't actually get saved in the end, that it is just part of the,
Yeah, it's a
like,
piece of the puzzle
step-
that needs
piece
to
of
be
the
put in
puzzle that
place,
needs
right.
to happen.
That's my
So
understanding.
it's actually not, there's nothing in it for them.
I guess it's ironic
they're
because
just
they're using their support
tool.
temporarily.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's my understanding.
But there's also Jews who are against the founding of Israel, and
Oh, yeah.
you know, really strong, and not just for moral grounds, but for theological grounds too, which I don't fully understand, but it's in.
Yeah,
Orthodox.
yeah, my understanding of it is that, according to Jewish law, there should not be a Jewish state until the coming of the Messiah, right? And so this is a violation of Jewish law, and that's many Orthodox, that's their position. Actually, they're ironically Orthodox in Israel who are against the Israeli state.
It's not complicated.
It's like an AT&T commercial.
Yeah, so they're there and they, but they don't believe. This is why right now a big domestic political fight in Israel is the Israeli government wants Orthodox to serve in the Israeli military. Everyone, man and woman, male or female, is drafted into the Israeli army right now at age 18, I think, or 19, except for Orthodox because of these religious grounds, because they're not going to fight for a state they don't believe in. Also, there's this idea that they should be spending all their time praying, and that will do more for the Jewish people than fighting. But the Israeli government is pushing them to serve. So, yeah, that further complicates.
I just, maybe I misunderstood, but, we're talking about the U.S. support of Israel.
Uh-huh.
But you said that a U.S. military general trained Fatah.
Huh.
Isn't that sort of a conflict of interest?
Well, not if you look at it from the perspective of Oslo and creating these peaceful neighboring states. So in the same way that the United States could train military in Guatemala and Mexico, the idea is part of creating a peaceful, friendly, neighboring Palestinian state is they need to have a peaceful, friendly, neighborly military. So yeah, but of course there are a lot of people in Israel and Americans who are Israeli supporters who are totally against that. And these are the folks who, are at least at this point against a Palestinian state at all. But no, that's.
You guys have any questions? Sarah, Katie, Travis, Kim? Oh, okay. I don't know, what type of, I know you haven't been in Jordan, right? You've been in Jordan?
Yeah.
Okay, so the attitude of the Lebanese towards the Palestinians, how do you think it's different than the Jordanians towards the Palestinians?
It's a good question. I hung out with a Palestinian guy the whole time I was in Jordan. And my sense from him and just what you can read is that Jordanian Palestinians have almost equal rights to Jordanians. The only thing they can't do is serve in the Jordanian military. But they're definitely, both legally and culturally, far better regarded than Palestinians in Lebanon are. Palestinians in Lebanon are treated like second-class citizens, but not by everyone, but by many people. I mean, there's literally a list of jobs that they are legally allowed to do. Like you can't be an architect, you can't be a lawyer if you're Palestinian. You can only be these certain. You can't be a taxi driver if you're Palestinian.
Can't be?
You can't be. No. You're not allowed to buy property if you're Palestinian in Lebanon unless you buy it from within a Palestinian refugee camp. Yeah, they're treated like crap. And in Jordan, I mean, it'd be interesting. I'd like to hear what you learned after going there. But my sense is that it's definitely better than Lebanon, and it's
Aren't they
It's
considered
almost-
Jordanian citizens?
Yes,
in
yeah.
Jordan?
They are. Whereas Palestinians in Lebanon are not Lebanese citizens. So, yeah, but I didn't, I didn't go to any of the camps, the refugee camps.
Did you
in Jordan.
travel into the West Bank from Jordan ever?
No, I haven't.
That's a good question.
Floating in the Dead Sea. You already showed us.
Yeah, when I flew into Tel Aviv last summer, and then went from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and the West Bank.
And did you have a hard time getting into the West Bank at all, or what did you
No.
you just go right in?
I just went right in.
Getting out is supposed to be more difficult than getting in.
Yeah.
Really?
Getting out, flying out of Tel Aviv. I was questioned for a little while because I have Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese stamps all over my passport, so I got a second passport, which you can actually do. I went to the passport office in Philadelphia and I told them exactly what I was doing, and they're like, "All right, you need a second passport." And because I guess for like people doing business in two countries that are in conflict with one another, it's common. So it's the United States issues that very very easily. But so I had this brand new passport that was issued a week before I traveled, just crystal clean, and they were asking me about that. They're like, "Why do you have a passport that's brand new?" And I was pretty honest with them. Not completely, but I said, all right, I was sort of honest with them. I said, I'm a professor and I'm going to a conference in Lebanon next year, and I can't have an Israeli stamp on my passport to go into Lebanon, which is true. If you have an Israeli stamp on your passport, Lebanon will not let you in. In fact, no Arab country will except for Jordan and Egypt. And then they kind of sent me somewhere else, and they looked through my.
Yeah, you got into Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I have Israeli.
Oh, do you? You got into Saudi Arabia?
Uh-huh.
Oh, okay.
You have an
I stand
Israeli
corrected.
stamp?
Is it still your same passport?
Huh? Yeah. Maybe. Well, those guys barely even check. They're just like.
And so, I kind of left Saudi Arabia out of this altogether, but the Saudis don't have an official peace treaty with Israel, but they share a lot of the same interests.
Yeah.
Neither wants Iran.
Yeah, they're de facto allies, just don't tell each other.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, getting out of Israel, flying out of Tel Aviv. So I was with a group of 12 professors, 6 African American professors, 5 white American professors, and 1 Asian American professor. All 6 of the African Americans were detained and extensively questioned.
So, like, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised.
And
But why do you think? I mean, what was funny? You talked about this on the plane or whatever. Like, what?
well, we all had different flights,
Oh, okay.
and so so this was just individually. We all had different times, and afterwards, we communicated by email, and all of the African American professors were detained.
But why do you think so?
More of a likelihood that they might be Muslim.
Maybe. According to Israelis and Palestinians that I know, there's a lot of racism there. I mean, there's one of the largest growing populations in Israel are Ethiopian Jews, and they're treated like crap.
They're afraid of a lot of, like, a growing population of Ethiopian Jews, Africans coming in and claiming Judaism.
Yeah. It should also be noted that, it's not like Palestinians and other Arab countries aren't racist toward people of African descent as well. I mean, I saw that in Lebanon especially. It was vicious there, but so the short, easy, simple answer is racism, but there might be a more complicated answer to that.
I had a girl that I went to Saudi with. She's Palestinian, and when the Palestinians got their passports, she was born in America, but her parents were born in what is today Israel, Palestine, and they got passports when passports were issued, and she had a Palestinian. She had an American. I think she has both, but she had an American passport, and she went to Israel, and she wanted to go visit the family, where they had been born, and she went in, and they took her U.S. passport, stamped her passport, and she started to go through, and some flag must have come up. And she, they held her back, and then they took a black Sharpie and crossed it off and told her to leave, and
Wow.
let her back in.
Wow.
So they wouldn't let her through. Yeah.
You said, Covenant, that the several of the Arab countries treated the Jews terribly in the 1940s. And we found in Egypt that there was a lot of Jews that lived in Alexandria, and that Nasser did have nationalism and all, but it was, I understood it to be more of an incentive to come to Israel than it was to leave the Arab countries. And there's also this film about Jews in Baghdad longing for Baghdad or those days.
Yeah. Yeah, I
So
mean,
when you said that, you know,
kind of oversimplified it.
well,
I mean, there's some push-pull factors there, and it was different in different countries. The Jewish population actually increased in Lebanon after 1948. It was the only Arab country where the Jewish population increased, and that's because southern Lebanon is part of biblical Israel. So some Jews went to southern Lebanon, or who were already in southern Lebanon, and were like, well, we're already here, so we don't need to go. And then other Jews coming from other Arab countries would go to southern Lebanon. But like in Tunisia and Libya, immediately after the state of Israel was formed, there were instances of riots and violence against Jews. But I mean, you're right; it is more complicated than I put it. That the pull factor of we can go to a nation state where we're part of the majority rather than the minority, whether that was for religious reasons or just social and political reasons, I think was definitely a contributing factor. But I mean, I think to say that there's not and there hasn't been anti-Jewish sentiment in the Arab world is not a fair statement, right? I mean, just like, anywhere in the world, there's that. However, I think Palestinians especially are very keen to distinguish between anti-Israel and anti-Jewish.
Yeah, saw that, yeah. Saw that in Egypt.
Yeah, and there are some people, for whatever reason, maybe because they just have a provincial mindset or whatever, who all they've ever known was Judaism and Israel, Jews, Israelis as one and the same, right? They haven't, traveled to America or Europe, and they haven't met Jews from other parts of the world. And so for them, and this isn't to justify it, but for them, being anti-Israel is the same as being anti-Jew. But for the vast majority of people, in fact, just about everyone I met, there's not really an anti-Jewish sentiment. In fact, Palestinian society and Lebanese society as well really pride themselves on being religiously diverse and religiously tolerant. And so, I met so many people who said you have no problem at all with Jews, Judaism. I met a Palestinian family in the Borj Liberation Camp in Beirut. Said, they can stay in Palestine. We are hospitable people. We will take in as many Jews as we want to come, but we want to go there too. It's our home too. And I thought that sort of embodied the sentiment that I heard a lot from a lot of people. For Palestinians, it's an anti-Zionist, an anti-Israeli struggle, not an anti-Jewish struggle. And even for a lot of Palestinians, it's not even an anti-Israeli struggle. It's an anti-occupation struggle.
When you teach this, are there certain points that you see like students kind of get a aha, now I get it, rather, because we have been taught differently. At least my generation was very much taught differently, and maybe the students that are going through, because of teachers like yourself, see it differently than what I did as a student. But, what are the things that,
Can I speak to that?
Yes.
I feel like
please,
what I've been taught, and one of the things that I run into, is directly related to that guilt. We focus so much on what happened during the Holocaust, and so much about the Jewish diaspora, and so on and so forth, that's sort of the side that's always told, is the Jews are finally allowed to go home. And so that's something that I feel like I was taught that way, and I run into even teaching it. That sentiment still seems to be there.
well, I think so, and I think that's really, I think that is a Holocaust industry to perpetuate this. I mean, now we need to, now the Pennsylvania is saying that you have to teach it how many years? I mean, they're trying to pass that has to be integrated.
And not to take anything away from it, but my students are exhausted on it. By the time they get to us, like, they almost, not ingest, because they're not really downplaying what happened, but they almost want to be like, we know about the Holocaust, we know what happened, but it's so driven by that, right? And the term Holocaust doesn't just apply there.
Well, you know what, it's also the popular culture. I mean, when the History Channel used to show history, it would be on there, and it's dramatic, and when I was in Nanjing last year at the Massacre Museum, and people were saying, well, the same thing, they're saying, well, the Japanese are animals. And I said, well, this was a Chinese person who came to me on this. I said, well, this is a story about man's brutality against man. And you go to the Holocaust Museum, they've packaged it that way. This is not an issue of one ethnicity versus another. This is an issue of man's brutality against man, which obviously some of the stuff we talk about here, there should be a segment in the Holocaust Museum that deals with the Palestinian, with ethnic cleansing, that's the first time I've heard the term ethnic cleansing. We've talked about, and my understanding was these were refugees of war. When they caught in a civil war, they left, and when the war didn't settle the way they did, and I read a novel, Leon Yoris wrote the novel Exodus, which was
that was part of our huge propaganda.
Well, it was interesting because in some ways, though, as I read the novel, and I don't read many novels that, this is what my mother recommended. Leon Yoris is Jewish, but the idea of people who are waiting for something to happen in these refugee camps, who are waiting for the right to return, it never happens, and the idea is what keeps them from returning. What keeps a country from allowing people who want to buy or sell territory there and locks them out because of ethnic identity, and that's the real trick here.
No, I want to see Exodus again, because that was a movie, in my generation, Paul Newman was in it. It romanticized the European flight.
I'm thinking the wrong movie. I'm thinking the book of the Hajj, not the Exodus of the Hajj.
Oh, okay, because Exodus, come on.
No,
I want to see that.
He wrote both of them.
Yeah, he wrote both of them, yeah.
But just to get back to your question, Elaine, the one correction I always have to make with students is, and I don't know if there's a single aha moment. One of the first things they read is the piece that I sent to you by Robert Fisk on the Keys of Palestine. And I find that that's a pretty good introduction to the notion that the creation of one state meant the destruction of another. And I think Robert Fisk humanizes all the players really well. But as we move along, there's always a student or two who says, well, the Israelis are just like the Nazis. This is just like the Holocaust. And I have to correct them. No, this is not the same. The murder of 7 million Jews is not the same as the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians. And there's a difference between genocide and ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is the removal, the displacement of people from one territory to another. And that might include some deaths, but it's more about that movement, whereas genocide is the murder of an entire group of people based on their ethnicity. And I think it's a really dangerous equation to make. And it really, I think politically it gets us nowhere, because no one, it's I don't know, I definitely, I think there's danger in exclusively looking at the Holocaust and, propping the Holocaust up on a pedestal and ignoring every other human tragedy. But like every time someone wants to find something bad they compare it to Hitler,
Oh, yeah,
to
that's-
Nazi,
yeah.
or the Holocaust. And I think the ethnic cleansing of Palestine can be seen as a tragedy, as a catastrophe, as Palestinians put it, without equating it to the Holocaust. And I think historically, analytically, that's incorrect, and politically, it's counterproductive. And so that's a response I often get from students. It's like, oh, this is the same thing. And there are similarities, and maybe, for the brighter students, you can sort of tease out those similarities, but it's not the same thing. It's not.
I find it interesting though that a group that has been displaced for so long would then
That's so,
ultimately displace another group.
I feel the same, you take the genocide out of the Holocaust, please, right? But I mean, that displacement, and then you turn around and I would be really interested to see, like, how some, the European Jews dealt with that. I mean, seeing that, that, to me, that's a part that I'm struggling with, because
There's
they
such
turn around and doing
irony there.
that small part, the same,
Right. And I mean, I can't speak for anyone in that position. But I think Robert Fisk's piece, The Keys of Palestine, it addresses that. There are Israelis who acknowledge that, and they're like, yeah, it's a tragedy, it's sad, but, we're not going to be killed again, in whatever means.
survival,
Yeah.
survival.
And then there's another piece, it was one about the 67 war, I forget the author's name, that I sent to you, where the author says, is this metaphor of, I'm going to get this wrong, something like something about a ledge, and like the metaphor of Israelis are sitting out on this ledge and Palestinians are pushed off their ledge. I'm going to get it wrong. Never mind. It's a really good metaphor. Trust me. Yes.
Our audience, our video audience has a few questions, so I'm just
sure.
gonna, if you
Yeah.
don't mind. So they said, I'm wondering where Dr. Ross saw while he was in Palestine in terms of art and resistance. Were there visual symbols of Palestinian nationalism or unity? Thinking of graffiti, other art forms. Is there visual evidence of a Palestinian identity?
Absolutely. All over the place. Yeah. Really beautiful graffiti, particularly on the separation barrier. And some of that's international graffiti, like Banksy has all these murals up on the separation barrier. But you could spend hours just in one 30-foot segment of the separation barrier looking at all this graffiti. Really small, people write messages, big, huge murals. I mean, gorgeous artwork to some extent. In fact, some Palestinians have said, we shouldn't be making this wall so beautiful. It's actually ugly. So yeah, there's that. There's a really great film called Slingshot Hip Hop, which I recommend, especially for students. And it's about Palestinian hip hop as a means of cultural resistance. And in that film, there's also some graffiti, but it's mostly about the hip hop. And if you've never listened to Palestinian hip hop, it's gorgeous. I mean, obviously, hip hop was created by, born out of African American and Latino communities, but it almost sounds like that genre was made for the Arabic language. It's just gorgeous. Even if you don't understand Arabic, it's really wonderful. So Slingshot hip hop, I recommend. But yeah, and everywhere you go in the West Bank, there's artwork. I went to a music conservatory where they're teaching young kids how to play the violin and cello, and it's for free basically. It's a big charity funded by, I think, a Norwegian group. And for them, they explicitly say music is our way of resisting. It's our way of resisting this dehumanization process. So yes, there's plenty of that.
I have another question from Travis. He said, this might not be fully applicable to what was talked about, but what influence does Hamas have on many of the Palestinian refugees living in Jordan? Is the location of the West Bank and the rise of Hamas and the PLC a threat to the Jordanian monarchy as they share a border?
The first part of that question, I don't know. I don't know what kind of role Hamas has in Jordan. I know Hamas has a stake in Syria, among Syrian Palestinians in Syria, not so much in Lebanon, but to some extent. And the second part of the question was about the West Bank and.
So, is the location of the West Bank and the rise of Hamas and the PLC a threat to, hold on, someone just asked another question, a threat to the Jordanian monarchy as they share a border?
At this point, no, because the Israeli military controls almost the entire border between the West Bank and Jordan. Not just the border, but if you remember from one of those maps, it's like a pretty big swath of land. So there aren't even Palestinians living anywhere near the Jordanian border. So there's definitely no threat from Palestinians at this point to the Jordanian monarchy.
I have a question, or I don't have a question, something to look at. I heard a presentation at the World Affairs Council several years ago, and it was by someone, somebody from RAND, and they had said, what would an economical, viable West Palestinian state look like? And this connection between Gaza and the West Bank. And they're not that far apart. I mean, I wish I could say the miles right now, but if there was a turnpike between that and to have those together, how that would help things. And, what could take place. So there is this, if everyone, what would a viable, given, all that we've heard, but Rand did a study on that. It was interesting. It was like, okay, pie in the sky, but let's think big. So.
Yeah, I mean, because Gaza right now is so isolated. This sounds outrageous, but you can go to Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, and they kind of broke this story that Israel is counting the calories of Palestinians in Gaza and only allowing in so much food that they can have just so many calories to continue surviving. Right? So there's virtually no farmland or arable land left in Gaza because of the borders. There's not much fishing, and so most of the food that Palestinians eat is allowed in by Israel through international aid, and they are literally counting the calories of Palestinians.
Can you say something about the health of Palestinians? I mean, during the first Intifada, the health and education, the Palestinians were not thought of as poor people,
right,
or uneducated people.
Right.
But now, when somebody's, I guess, do you have any kind of comparisons as to what it was before or after?
No, I mean, okay. not anything specific. In terms of education, the first Intifada was interesting because Israel shut down just about all of the Palestinian universities during the first Intifada, but Palestinians continued to hold classes, and so they would secretly, it was illegal to have a gathering, I think, of more than 4 or 5 Palestinians. If you did that, you had to have a permit from Israel, and so they would secretly meet students and professors in people's basements and living rooms. I don't know if they're in the basements, but in the privacy of someone's home to have classes. In Israeli prisons, there were so many Palestinians that they started education groups in the prison, and many people, got their entire equivalent of a college education in prison. And so even through that, education was very, very valued. What I learned last summer, having visited all of the Palestinian universities, is that the Palestinian universities are really struggling to get by. And this is mostly really with the fall of the PLO, or the diminishing of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and Yasser Arafat, who used to just lavish money on the universities. Now they are very restricted. The sciences, Israel won't allow them to import any equipment for labs, chemistry, forget it. I mean, I met with a lot of geographers because I'm a geographer, and they aren't able to get much of the remote sensing equipment, but they still are there. People are still very adamant about getting educated. A lot of Palestinians with money will go abroad to go to college, and then they run into this problem, and this is one of the things I encountered a lot last summer, was Palestinians who are very well educated can choose between staying in Palestine and not getting a job or being severely underemployed, or going abroad and being very successful, but essentially losing their home in Palestine. And so it was this internal struggle a lot of folks were dealing with. I love my country, I want to stay here as a means of resistance of just being here, because these Israelis don't want me here, especially those based in Jerusalem, or go abroad and take care of their families and earn some money, knowing that they might not ever be able to come back, particularly if they're from Jerusalem. So yeah, in terms of education, it's more difficult than ever now. I don't know about statistics and in health. The health in Gaza is a lot worse. I mean, the World Health Organization has called this a humanitarian disaster. In the West Bank, I'm not as familiar in terms of the health there.
How much longer do you think the United States can continue to support that with world opinion?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems that internationally people are wanting this resolved, including the United States, but I don't understand how we can do nothing with no sanctions.
That's a good question.
See
I
that
wish I knew the answer.
thing? I mean, that's the only
That's something I was wondering too. Someone had asked earlier about more conservative-minded people kind of rallying around Israel, and our foreign policy is very, if you say anything against Israel, you get just nailed in the news. Do you think that has anything to do with maybe like the war on terror post 9/11 world, where it's maybe a more conservative side and see it as like an anti-Arab step hold in the region?
Maybe.
And it was that way for so long prior.
It precedes the war on terror, but I think that definitely intensified things. But I mean, I don't know. To answer your question, I think public opinion in America and abroad is definitely changing. I mean, we are at it beyond a tipping point, I think, in terms of public opinion. The pro-Israel lobby is still one of the strongest lobbies in the country. I mean, look at Cuba, for example.
I was just going to say that's one of the way outsourced.
Yeah, it's such an outdated embargo around Cuba, but that pro-Cuban lobby.
And they're very small, but they turned the election in 2000. I mean, it was just a small group of people.
Yeah.
They're determined.
Yeah. Go ahead.
There's another question. Kim asked if he had any thoughts on the controversy over Kerry's recent comments.
Like when he mentioned apartheid, I imagine?
Yeah, I think we had discussed it before they were.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that, I mean, as I was saying before, he in some ways called a spade a spade. Jimmy Carter has said it's apartheid. So many South Africans have said it's apartheid. And Kerry didn't even say it was apartheid. He said, well, if things don't get better now, it could become an apartheid state in the future. And then, like, within 24 hours, he backtracked and said, no, it's not apartheid. So, and who knows who was whispering in his ear. But I don't know. I mean, I'm feeling, I don't actually think the Obama administration is any more critical of Israel than Bush, Clinton, Bush, Reagan, etc. I think he's pretty much towed the line. I think what's changed is the Israeli government has become more right-wing. I mean, so it's like the United States has kind of stayed where they are, and Israel's gone more to the right, and so now it seems like Obama is more critical of Israel, but I don't think he is.
Coming out and saying specifically against settlements and. I mean, really?
But he's not against settlements. He's calling for halting settlement construction. right? Actually, George Bush
Right.
Sr. was probably the most critical of Israel president we've had recently, because he actually said, he pretty much laid down the law and said, if you don't stop this settlement construction, we're going to back
Baker
off.
said that, yeah.
And
Sharon, not, right? Not during-
during Sharon,
He's pretty right.
yeah,
During Baker?
No, I think
Perez.
Bush Senior.
Bush
Oh,
Senior,
sorry.
yeah.
Bush
sorry.
Senior.
Okay.
So, I don't know. I mean, it was, the apartheid flap was, I don't know, it was indicative, I think, of, number one, what the situation is like on the ground, number two, how the United States is kind of in this bind. I mean, how can they continue to justify it?
Well, I know, I mean, this is not their question, but I just know that there have been so many articles, and Sammy Hermes has been posting a lot of
Yeah.
them, so I've been following him,
Yeah,
that, you know, even about boycotting of college professors, boycotting going to conferences in Israel or having Israelis come. And so I'm just wondering if that amount that has been going on for about a year and a half, almost two, is now really surfacing into kind of the mainstream government
yeah,
dialogue too.
yeah. I mean, just a note on that, Sammy and I are both on, Sammy Hermes was a postdoc here, what, 2 years ago? A year ago?
It's been 2 years.
Yeah. Anyway, he's a,
Last year.
yeah, Lebanese American
Oh, yeah.
scholar and
Oh,
anthropologist.
Yes.
And he and I are both on the organizing collective of the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And this movement is part of the larger boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which Palestinian civil society has called for as a nonviolent means to resist continued Israeli occupation. One misconception of the academic boycott is that we are calling for a boycott of Israeli scholars. It's not a boycott of individual Israelis. It's a boycott of collaborations with Israeli academic institutions. So in other words, actually I think Pitt's SJP has endorsed this probably before you were, I think when Ryan was here, endorsed the call. So in other words, it's a call to not have a study abroad program from Pitt specifically with an Israeli university. Or it's, don't, if there's a conference held at an Israeli university, don't attend that conference. And the idea here is not just, oh, well, all Israelis are bad. It's that the Israeli universities themselves are deeply embedded in the Israeli military and deeply involved in continued occupation and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And so like Hebrew University, for example, in Jerusalem, recently, within the last few years, expanded its campus by simply having the Israeli military demolish a whole Palestinian neighborhood. Palestinians in Jerusalem who then lost their Palestinian residency card and had to leave. And so there's been a call among Palestinians to boycott Israeli universities for that. And every Israeli university, I mean, you can look this up on the USACBEI website, is involved in different aspects militarily with the occupation. So I don't mean to go on too much of a tangent of that, but
No, I was just wondering if that kind of movement, because think about it too, we know people in academia are the ones who go then and debrief people in the State Department. So I'm just wondering if those two kind of are starting to get that
I mean, I think there's
discourse.
there's a big
No?
iron wall, I think, between like someone like Sammy Hermes and the State Department.
No, I'm not
Yeah.
saying Sam, I'm just saying this discourse
Yeah.
is entering.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I think Carrie also mentioned the threat of boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS. And I mean, that, just the fact that he mentions it is a sign that this is a movement that is gaining, I mean, as you say, it's in the popular discourse now. It can't be ignored. Whether you agree with it or not, it's something that's gaining a lot of traction.
What about the idea that the Palestinian Authority is now working with Hamas?
Mm-hmm. So the reconciliation. Well,
Or just the idea that they initiated this while this peace process is going on.
Yeah. I mean, I think they initiated it once they realized the peace process was over.
Was over, not going, okay.
Yeah. And I don't know, I mean, both Fatah and the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas, they're not very popular at all, even in the West Bank. Like, hardly anyone really sees them as legitimate leaders. They weren't democratically elected, or they were at some point, and they've just stayed in office. If they had elections, they wouldn't be reelected. They're very unpopular. But reconciling with Hamas, who also is losing popularity in Gaza, this is really a smart political move internally within Palestinian society for both of them, because a unified Palestine, there are hardly any Palestinians who would speak out against that. Whoever it is, that we're unified and have a common cause. So I think, strategically it made sense for both Hamas and Fatah. And Fatah, I'm sort of using that interchangeably with Palestinian Authority because they control the Palestinian Authority. But then I think Israel immediately saying the peace process is over as soon as that reconciliation was made. I mean, it illustrates very clearly, and again, this isn't a conspiracy theory, they'll say this up front, they don't want to deal with a united Palestine. They wanted to deal with a divided Palestine, right? This is, and some people will say, well, it's because Hamas is a terrorist organization and they call for the destruction of Israel and they fire rockets into civilian areas, which is all true. And that's why Israel would be like the United States negotiating with Al-Qaeda. I mean, that's how Israelis would put it. But nevertheless, it does show that, kind of shows their hand that they don't want to deal with the unified Palestinian leadership.
Any other comments here? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.